bees or Monsanto. That said, there is an obvious relation of both of those and many other factors with the decline in honeybees that we're seeing. And I'm honored to have been asked to come here and talk to you guys today about it. So, honeybees, the most important insect that exists. They're responsible, according to most statistics, for 1 out of 3 bites of food that you take. I tend to disagree with that, especially with a crowd like this. I would assume that most of us are eating pasture-raised, grass-fed meats. Um, when you eat locally produced grass-fed meat, that statistic probably changes to more like 2 out of every 3 bites you take is dependent on a honeybee, because lots of the weeds and wildflowers in those fields that those animals are eating are dependent on honeybee pollination. So these insects that are so crucial to each and every one of our lives are in a great deal of danger due to many contributing factors. Um, these insects are social insects. They live in communities or colonies of between 10 and 60,000 bees, which would consist of one queen, a few hundred drones, which are the male bees, and all the rest are female virgin worker bees. And essentially, they all work together as a community for the well-being of one. They're not selfish in any way. If one bee is eating honey in a hive, all the bees are eating honey. If they're all starving, they all starve. You know, if they can't get to honey, if they can get to honey, they will share it amongst their entire community, their colony, to keep each other alive. So that said, I think we could really learn a lot from these bees and working together to make whatever idea we have work rather than being selfish and trying to accomplish it by ourselves. Um, Honeybees are in touch with almost everything. They're in touch with the weather, they're in touch with the sun, the moon, the seasons, um, everything around us. And I guess you could consider it an indicator species. Unfortunately, we are seeing the indications, and it is probably getting very close to being too late if we don't do something now. And what I mean by an indicator species is that the bees are starting to die due to other reasons that we most certainly control. They're indicating to us that there is a severe problem, and the severe problem is with a broken agriculture and broken food system that we have. It does not work sustainably. Um, so what's happening to the honeybees? Um, In essence, it's many things. I'm sure everyone's heard the negative press related to honeybees disappearing and or dying. Unfortunately, we can't pinpoint that to one thing. What we can pinpoint that to is typically it's a combination of things. Lots of times it's a combination of things involving chemicals, whether it's chemicals that beekeepers are using or chemicals that agriculture is using. Um, Bees are not native to North America. They came here in 1622 um, and really did well up until the early 80s. Um, and then in the early 80s, there were several insects and disease that came and really started wiping out the colonies. So the beekeepers had to use chemicals inside the beehives to treat these pests. Had they not done so, we would have lost all of our bees. So they were actually doing the right thing. Unfortunately, with the industrialization of agriculture, along came industrialization of beekeeping, and that has been kind of the stand-to for the past 50 years. The guy that has 1 or 2 beehives in his yard manages them the same way as the commercial beekeeper that moves 20,000 colonies to the almonds to do pollination each year. And as we know, a small farm and a large-scale farm operate in 2 different ways. Unfortunately, with beekeeping, that's not the way. So a lot of these beekeepers are dumping chemicals into their hives to help treat the mites. And those are effective and they don't hurt the bees. What hurts the bees is when these bees go out and forage and get pollen or nectar from a plant that may have been treated with some sort of systemic insecticide or fungicide, any pesticide, and bring it back to the hive. And now you have 2 chemicals that are A-OK or okay, I wouldn't say A-OK, that the bees can tolerate. But then when you combine them inside the hive, you have this deadly synergistic effect to the honeybees. One of the big problems that we have with our industrialized agriculture and food system is it's based on monocultures for the most part. So, for instance, you go out west, they grow almonds. People truck tens of thousands of honeybee hives to the almonds every year because they're dependent on honeybee pollination. So those stresses alone on moving hives across country, stress the bees out. They move them to an area that is essentially one type of pollen and one type of nectar, not a diverse diet that these bees need. They have tens of thousands of acres of one flower to work. And bees like us need a diverse diet. So that's a huge problem. Not to mention, all those almond fields are getting sprayed with fungicides, insecticides, pesticides, so there again, you have this synergistic effect. Another problem with the bees that many people don't even realize is that our U.S. Forest Service, to be active in forest management operation, you have to plant pine trees. You can't manage a forest, a natural forest of a mix of different trees, which would provide forage for all pollinators, including honeybees. Instead, our Forest Service likes us to create a drought for pollinators by planting pine trees, which uh, produce no benefit to any pollinator. They do produce lots of pollen, but it's not very nutritious, so they don't use it. So you have these extreme monocultures, throughout that our government's putting down on us, commercial agriculture, but then you have lots of homeowners that take pride in their turf. There again, turf is a desert for nectar and pollen and any sort of native pollinator or honeybees. So they go out and spray all their weeds, which are actually wildflowers, which everything needs to reproduce and live. Um, so it's just another form of monoculture that we're creating. So we have all these monocultures that take away food sources for bees, and oftentimes on these monocultures, we're applying some sort of pesticide, fungicide, whether it be a contact insecticide or pesticide or a systemic. It's still, the systemic insecticides are absorbed by a plant. And then as the bees get the nectar or the pollen, they're bringing it back to the hive. And unfortunately, lots of the research that these chemical companies have hired many of the leading bee researchers, especially Monsanto, across the US to do their research on honeybees. Well, of course, we can all guess that all of their results are saying these pesticides aren't really harming the bees that much. But all their tests are on adult bees. But what they're not doing is testing, the colony's longevity or testing the larva or the pupa. And unfortunately, pollen, adult bees don't eat pollen. Young bees do, baby bees do. So with them testing only adult bees for all these effects that their pesticides are not having, they're not even doing research in the areas where the bees that are actually consuming the pollen and consuming this nectar that is contaminated, there's no research being done there. So it's a huge issue that they're creating for us, across the nation with bees as well. Um, One of the other issues that the bees are facing is just, like I said, lack of forage. There's tons of insects and disease around, and just not many beekeepers. Back even 20 years ago, there was beekeepers everywhere, and now there's just a lack of them. Um, and I want to stress that all of these problems are being seen and related to honeybees. But all of these problems are really affecting all pollinators. The only reason you ever hear any press specifically about honeybees is because all native pollinators, bumblebees, mason bees, blue orchard bees, carpenter bees, they're not managed. They're not beekeepers out there that manage tens or hundreds or thousands of these colonies to actually be able to tell what these environmental effects are having on their colonies. So we don't really know. Butterflies are the same way. We don't really know what all these things are having an effect on these other types of pollinators. So it's really serious because they obviously pollinate a lot of our food too. Um, and as far as GMOs go, there's really no studies there again being done in relation to the nectar and pollen coming from GMO plants that I'm aware of in the longevity of honeybees. Like I said, they're really only testing adult bees, and all these research places invite beekeepers to send them samples of bees so they can test for pesticides. In your samples, it has to be adult bees. Nobody's requesting samples of larvae or comb or pollen or anything like that. So there's a huge flaw in a lot of the research that's going on. And then real quick, back to pesticides. I just want to note that if you'll notice the terms pesticide, fungicide, insecticide, homicide, they all have this side in common. And what that means is it's to kill, the act of killing. So even if you're at home gardening using organic pesticides, you have to know that they're still killers. Just because you're gardening organically, it's great. You're not using synthetics. But your products can, if not used properly, if you don't read the label and read the recommendations, it can still kill any of these pollinators, including honeybees. It's very important if you are going to use any pesticide, to use it and use it cautiously and by the label. And with some of these GMOs, unfortunately, they're taking some organic pesticides like BT and with their splicing that they're doing to it. And in my opinion, eventually it's going to lead to breeding some super insects that, are resistant. So that's something always be mindful of, only treat stuff that needs treating and only treat when it needs treating. And another huge problem with these pesticides that we have outside of agriculture is they're widely available to homeowners, and oftentimes homeowners are unskilled and untrained on how to use them, and they just buy bottles of them and go out and dump them out, not protecting themselves or the environment, which is extremely dangerous. So with all that said, I think that the things that can be done to help protect the honeybees and other pollinators by all of us. Number one would obviously be become a beekeeper. Not everybody's willing to do that, but you can support local beekeepers. You can buy local honey. You can buy their local products. You can support the local farms that the beekeepers do pollination for. Know where your food comes from, every aspect of it. You can plant pollinator plants. That said, I would guess over half the plants you would go to Lowe's or Home Depot, these big box stores, and purchase now are all treated with systemic insecticides, treated seeds, or treated in some way. So buy your plants from a local reputable nursery. Ask them how they were grown. Ask them if they're genetically modified or been treated with any type of insecticide. Because oftentimes homeowners try and do good for the bees, but end up doing bad by planting treated seeds or treated plants. Something along those lines. You can also support smaller honeybee research. There is some smaller honeybee research going on throughout the U.S. Small honeybee farms are doing their own research, and they're proving the large researchers wrong pretty much every step of the way. So, there again, if you have some spare money, donate to somebody, do some research, donate to somebody who's doing research right. Something else you can do is don't mow your grass. Let it grow tall. Let the weeds flower. I see weeds as wildflowers. All my bees pollinate them. They get nectar and pollen from them. So don't mow. Let your grass grow tall, and the weeds will flower. Don't spray your grass for weeds. And then buy local, biodynamic, organic food. Support local farms. And think organic, but buy local. At least you can talk to that farmer, and if he is applying chemicals, you can know exactly what he's applying, when he's applying them, and why he's applying them, rather than buying something off of a box store shelf that you really have no idea the history of. So I guess the main point of my speech is this is a really, really big problem. It's happening now, and all of us are the only ones that can do anything about it. So, and we can only do something about it if we learn from the bees and come together and really try and make change as a community instead of as one. So I really appreciate you guys having me out here. I'll be over there. Be glad to answer your questions, talk to any of you. So thank you again.